My parents kicked me out in 11th grade for being pregnant. 22 years later, they showed up, hand over our grandson's trust fund. When I opened the door, my reply shocked them. What grandson? The heavy, custom-carved oak door of my Austin penthouse felt incredibly cool against the palm of my hand. I stood there, perfectly still, letting the vibrations of the frantic pounding from the hallway travel through the solid wood and into my bones. It was a rhythmic, demanding thud, the kind of knock that belonged to people who genuinely believed the world owed them something. I am 39 years old today. I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of one of the most ruthless and profitable hospitality and technology conglomerates in the state of Texas. I have senators on my speed dial and board members who sweat when I clear my throat. But the people standing on the other side of that door didn't know the woman I had become. They only remembered the terrified, disposable 17-year-old girl they had thrown into the garbage 22 years ago. I glanced over at the glowing security monitor mounted on the marble wall in my foyer. The high-definition camera feed showed 3 faces I hadn't seen in the flesh for over 2 decades. There was Gregory, my biological father, his once sharp posture now slightly stooped, his expensive suit looking a little too loose, a little too desperate. Beside him stood Sylvia, my biological mother, her face pulled tight by years of aggressive cosmetic procedures, clutching a designer handbag like it was a shield. And hovering nervously behind them, looking like a cornered rat in a cheap blazer, was Cameron, my high school boyfriend. The boy who had promised me the moon right before he pushed me off a cliff. Through the thick soundproofing of my penthouse walls, I could hear Gregory's muffled, arrogant voice echoing in the private corridor. He was demanding that I open the door. He was demanding his rights. He was demanding to see, quote, his beloved grandson and, more importantly, he was demanding access to what he referred to as the family trust fund. A trust fund he firmly believed was his rightful blood inheritance. I let a slow, cold smile stretch across my face. My pulse didn't race. My hands didn't shake. There was no fear left in my body because fear had been burned out of me a very long time ago. Instead, what I felt was a profound, icy satisfaction. This moment was not an accident. It was not a twist of fate or a sudden coincidence of the universe. I had spent the last 22 years meticulously laying the bricks for this exact trap. Every hotel I acquired, every piece of software my company launched, every carefully worded press release I approved over the last decade had been a breadcrumb designed to lead these greedy, parasitic vultures straight to my doorstep. I did not open the door right away. Let them wait. Let them sweat under the hallway security cameras. Let them feel the heavy, oppressive silence of being ignored, just a fraction of what I had felt. I turned my head slightly to look at the small, understated silver frame resting on the console table next to me. Inside the frame was a photograph of a brilliant, smiling young man named Tristan. My son, my chosen blood. Next to the frame rested a tarnished silver necklace, cheap and old, the only thing I had managed to take with me on the night my life ended and began again. As the pounding on the door grew louder and more desperate, my mind didn't stay in the lavish, temperature-controlled environment of my penthouse. The sound acted like a pendulum, swinging me backward through time, tearing away the expensive tailored suit I wore and plunging me back into the stifling, suffocating air of my childhood home. I closed my eyes, and suddenly, I wasn't the billionaire CEO anymore. I was 17 again, standing in a sterile, overly bright bathroom, staring down at a little plastic stick that was about to shatter my entire universe. To understand the absolute audacity of the people pounding on my door, you have to understand the golden cage they built for me. Growing up, the Kensington household in the late 90s was not a home. It was a corporate headquarters disguised as a sprawling suburban mansion. Gregory was a cutthroat real estate developer who viewed human beings entirely through the lens of leverage and liability. To him, having a family was nothing more than a necessary public relations strategy to make him look trustworthy to investors. Sylvia, my mother, was his perfect counterpart. She was a woman entirely constructed of country club gossip, social standings, and superficial perfection. Love, in our house, was entirely conditional. You were loved as long as you looked good in the annual Christmas card, and as long as you didn't do anything to jeopardize the Kensington brand. I was a quiet, compliant teenager because rebelling in that house meant facing a psychological warfare that I simply wasn't equipped for. I got the straight A grades, I played the piano, I smiled for the cameras at my father's charity galas. And like an idiot, I looked for an escape hatch. That escape hatch came in the form of Cameron. Cameron was the son of a prominent corporate lawyer who ran in the same elite circles as my parents. He was the golden boy of our high school, captain of the tennis team, charming, with a smile that made you forget how shallow his eyes were. When he paid attention to me, I felt seen for the first time in my life. I mistook his teenage hormones and smooth talking for actual sanctuary. He would whisper all these grand promises in my ear, painting pictures of how we would go to college together, travel the world, and escape the heavy expectations of our families. I believed every single word. The illusion shattered violently during the spring of my junior year. I had been feeling sick for weeks, blaming it on the stress of final exams. But the nausea wouldn't fade, and the undeniable terror began to twist a knot in my stomach. I remember the exact temperature of the master bathroom in our house. It was freezing, walled in floor-to-ceiling white marble that made it feel like a mausoleum. I sat on the edge of the oversized bathtub, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold the plastic pregnancy test. I stared at the tiny digital window, praying to any god that would listen. When the two pink lines materialized, the air was sucked out of the room. It wasn't just fear I felt, it was the absolute certainty of my impending doom. In a normal family, a pregnant 17-year-old daughter is a crisis that is met with tears, maybe anger, but ultimately support. In the Kensington family, a pregnant teenage daughter was an unmitigated PR disaster. It was a stain on the immaculate white carpet of their reputation. For 2 agonizing weeks, I hid it. I wore baggy sweaters in the Texas heat, I skipped meals to hide my stomach, and I lived in a state of constant, suffocating panic. I tried to corner Cameron at school to tell him, but every time I looked at his carefree, arrogant face, the words caught in my throat. I knew, deep down, he wasn't the knight in shining armor I had pretended he was. The weight of the secret finally became too heavy to carry. I knew the truth would come out eventually, and I naively convinced myself that if I just owned up to it, if I just fell on my knees and begged for help, my parents would remember that I was their child. I thought their parental instinct would override their vanity. It was the most expensive miscalculation I have ever made in my entire life. The confrontation happened in the formal living room, a space that was rarely used for anything other than hosting local politicians. I stood in the center of the Persian rug, my hands clasped so tightly together that my knuckles were entirely white. Gregory was sitting in his high-backed leather armchair, reading a financial report. Sylvia was arranging a massive vase of imported lilies. I forced the words out of my mouth. I told them I was pregnant. I will never forget the silence that followed. There was no screaming. There were no tears, no gasps of shock, no emotional breakdowns. The silence was heavy, calculated, and deeply terrifying. It was the silence of a business transaction going south. Gregory slowly lowered his financial report. He didn't look angry. He looked disgusted, the way you would look at a piece of rotten food you accidentally stepped on. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't ask who the father was. He simply raised his left arm, pulled back the pristine cuff of his tailored shirt, and looked at his gold watch. "It is currently 8:15 in the evening," Gregory said, his voice entirely devoid of any human warmth. "You are no longer a member of this family. You are a liability. You have exactly 10 minutes to pack a single bag of your belongings and exit my property. If you are not gone by 8:25, I will have the private security detail remove you for trespassing." I stood there, paralyzed, waiting for the punchline, waiting for Sylvia to intervene. I turned to my mother. Sylvia didn't even look at me. With a fluid, practiced motion, she walked over to the mahogany mantel, picked up the silver-framed family portrait that featured the 3 of us, and deliberately laid it face down on the wood. The soft click of the frame hitting the mantel sounded like a judge's gavel sealing my death sentence. Panic finally broke through my paralysis. I ran up the grand staircase to my bedroom, tears blinding me. I grabbed a small canvas duffel bag and started shoving random clothes into it, jeans, sweaters, whatever my hands touched. I grabbed the few $100s I had saved from birthday gifts, and I grabbed a cheap silver necklace I had bought for myself years ago. With my hands shaking, I grabbed my phone and dialed Cameron's number. He answered on the third ring, sounding annoyed. I told him everything. I told him I was pregnant, that my parents were throwing me out, and that I needed him to come get me. I needed the sanctuary he had promised. The silence on his end of the line was different from my father's, but just as lethal. It was the silence of a coward calculating his own survival. "Are you crazy?" Cameron finally hissed, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "You can't pin this on me. My parents have lawyers. If you try to drag my name into this, they will destroy you. My college applications are going out next month. I am not ruining my future for your mistake. Do not ever call this number again." The line went dead. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, a flat line to my previous life. I walked back downstairs. My parents were standing by the massive front doors. They watched me with blank, dead eyes as I walked past them. The moment my feet crossed the threshold, Gregory slammed the heavy oak doors shut behind me. I heard the loud, heavy clank of the deadbolt sliding into place. I stood on the grand front porch, a 17-year-old pregnant girl holding a canvas bag, completely alone in the warm, humid Texas night, realizing that the people who gave me life had just erased my existence without shedding a single tear. If you have never been homeless, it is impossible to accurately describe the sheer, grinding terror of the first few nights on the street. The world you thought you knew instantly transforms into a hostile, predatory landscape. I didn't go to my friends' houses, their parents were in the same social circles as mine, and I knew a single phone call would result in the police dragging me right back to the sidewalk. I walked for hours that first night, my feet blistering in my useless designer sneakers, until I reached Zilker Park near downtown Austin. The darkness of the park wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. Every rustle of the leaves sounded like a threat. I found a wooden park bench hidden behind a thick cluster of oak trees and curled myself into the tightest ball possible, clutching my canvas duffel bag to my chest like a shield. I didn't sleep a single minute. I kept one eye open, watching the shadows, listening to the distant sirens of the city. I spent the entire night with one hand resting protectively over my flat stomach, terrified of what the stress and fear were doing to the tiny life growing inside me. The days blurred into a miserable, degrading routine of basic survival. Hunger became a constant, gnawing physical pain in my ribs. I had to stretch the few $100s I had to the absolute limit. I lived on the cheapest loaves of bread and jars of generic peanut butter I could find at a corner store. I washed my face in public restrooms, hiding from the harsh fluorescent lights that highlighted the dark, bruised circles under my eyes and the dirt ground into my skin. The physical toll was brutal, but the psychological degradation was worse. I learned to become invisible. I learned to look down when people walked past me, dodging the disgusted glares of women who looked exactly like my mother, carrying bags from stores I used to shop at. About a week into my nightmare, I used a payphone to check my high school email account at a public library. There was only one new message. It wasn't from Cameron. It was a formal, chillingly polite email from his father's law firm. It was a cease and desist letter, explicitly stating that any further contact with Cameron or his family would be considered harassment, and they would pursue maximum legal action against me. The letter accused me of trying to extort a minor. They were threatening a homeless, pregnant teenager with jail time to protect their son's pristine tennis record. I sat in that plastic library chair, staring at the glowing screen, and felt something inside me break. It wasn't just sadness anymore. The sadness was being pushed aside by something much darker, much heavier. It was the realization that in their world, I was not a human being. I was a problem to be eradicated. I logged out, walked back out into the blistering heat, and prepared myself for another night on the concrete, not knowing that the worst was yet to come. Texas weather is notoriously unpredictable, and during my third week on the streets, a freak, late-season cold snap descended on Austin. The temperature plummeted drastically overnight. The humid air turned brittle and icy, slicing through my thin sweater like razor blades. I didn't have a winter coat. I didn't have a blanket. I huddled under the slide of an empty children's playground, shaking so violently my teeth chipped against each other. By the second day of the cold snap, I was deeply sick. My chest burned with every breath, and a heavy, feverish fog clouded my brain. But the physical illness was nothing compared to the sudden, agonizing cramp that ripped through my lower abdomen late that evening. It was a sharp, tearing pain that forced a scream out of my throat, lost to the freezing wind. I knew. Even at 17, completely uneducated about pregnancy, my instincts screamed the truth. I dragged myself up from the freezing mulch of the playground, clutching my stomach, and stumbled blindly toward the dim yellow light of a nearby park pavilion. There was a public restroom there. The heavy metal door was unlocked. I pushed it open and collapsed onto the filthy, freezing tile floor of a bathroom stall. I will spare you the most graphic details, but I will not spare you the emotional reality of that night. Under the flickering, humming fluorescent light, in a room that smelled of stale urine and bleach, I miscarried my baby. I sat on that freezing floor, entirely alone, weeping in an agony so profound it felt like my soul was being ripped out through my chest. There was no hospital bed. There were no doctors. There was no one to hold my hand or tell me it was going to be okay. There was only the cold tile, my own blood, and the crushing, absolute finality of loss. I stayed in that stall for hours, completely hollowed out. As the physical pain dulled into a numb ache, the fever in my brain began to clear, replaced by a terrifying, hyper-focused clarity. I realized in that dark, filthy room that my parents and Cameron had not just abandoned me. Their arrogance, their obsession with their public image, their utter lack of basic human decency had forced me into the cold. They had, by proxy, murdered my child. The girl who had cried for her mother, the girl who had hoped Cameron would save her, died on that bathroom floor. I physically felt her die. In her place, something else took root. It was cold. It was metallic. It was a hatred so pure and concentrated it felt like rocket fuel in my veins. I leaned my head against the metal partition of the stall and made a silent vow to the universe. I swore that I would survive this. I swore that I would claw my way out of this gutter, and I would build a life so powerful, so untouchable, that one day, I would make them pay. I wouldn't use violence. I would use their own weapons. I would use money, power, and their own limitless greed to crush them into dust. When dawn finally broke, casting a pale, gray light over the frost-covered park, I dragged myself out of the restroom. I looked like a walking corpse. I managed to make it back to my usual wooden bench before my legs gave out completely. I collapsed onto the freezing wood, pulling my knees to my chest, closing my eyes, and waiting for whatever was supposed to happen next. I was too exhausted to fight anymore. "You are going to freeze to death out here, child." The voice was sharp, commanding, with a thick, refined southern drawl that cut right through my fever haze. I opened my eyes. Standing over me was an older woman, perhaps in her early 70s. She was wearing a stunning, full-length cashmere coat that looked softer than anything I had ever touched, and she was holding the leash of a very old, very fat golden retriever. She had silver hair perfectly styled, and her eyes, framed by expensive glasses, were scanning me with surgical precision. I tried to sit up, to mumble a lie about being fine, about waiting for a friend, but my teeth were chattering too hard to form the words. She didn't buy it for a second. She didn't look at me with pity or disgust. She looked at me with deep, calculating recognition. "I know what a broken girl looks like," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And I know the difference between a girl who has given up and a girl who is just too tired to stand. You are the latter. Come with me. We are getting breakfast, and you are getting warm." I didn't have the strength to refuse. I followed her to a sleek, black sedan parked on the edge of the street. The moment I opened the heavy car door, I was hit by a wave of glorious, artificial heat and the rich, calming scent of lavender and expensive leather. It was the smell of salvation. Her name was Loretta Montgomery. As we sat in a private booth at a high-end diner downtown, she ordered me a massive breakfast and watched me eat in silence. She didn't barrage me with intrusive questions. She simply waited until the color started to return to my face. Loretta was a widow who had inherited a single, struggling hotel from her late husband and ruthlessly built it into a highly profitable boutique chain across the South. She was a woman who had survived a man's world by being twice as smart and 3 times as unyielding. Over coffee, I finally broke down. I told her the entire story. I told her about the cage, the pregnancy, the 10 minutes, the betrayal, and the bloody nightmare in the public restroom. I expected her to offer me a tissue and some empty platitudes. Instead, Loretta reached across the table, grabbed my shaking hands in her firm, warm grip, and looked me dead in the eye. "Tears are a waste of hydration, Vivian," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. "The world is full of cruel, greedy men and weak, vain women. Your parents are cowards. That boy is a coward. If you stay on the street, they win. You become the tragedy they expected you to be. But if you want real revenge, if you want to make them bleed without ever throwing a punch, you build yourself. You build an armor of money and knowledge so thick they break their teeth trying to bite you." She let go of my hands and sat back. "I have a spare room in one of my properties. I have a job in the laundry room. You start tomorrow. We'll see what you're made of." Loretta didn't adopt me, she forged me. The next 4 years of my life were a grueling, relentless boot camp in corporate survival and psychological warfare. I didn't stay in the laundry room of her flagship Austin hotel for long. Loretta pushed me relentlessly. I moved from laundry to the front desk, to bookkeeping, to shadowing her in executive meetings. She didn't just teach me how to read profit and loss statements or how to negotiate with linen suppliers. She taught me how to read human weakness. She showed me how to spot the desperation in a vendor's eyes, how to flatter an arrogant investor while silently restructuring the deal in our favor, and how to maintain absolute, stone-cold emotional control in a room full of men who underestimated me because of my age. "Money isn't just currency, Vivian," Loretta told me late one night in her sprawling home office, pointing a crystal pen at a stack of ledgers. "Money is a moat. It is a wall. It is the only thing that separates the victims from the untouchables." It was during these crucial years of rebuilding that Loretta introduced me to the 2 people who would become the architects of my future revenge. The first was Donovan. Donovan was Loretta's chief legal counsel, a man who wore custom Italian suits and possessed a mind like a steel trap. He didn't practice law, he weaponized it. Donovan taught me the terrifying power of a well-drafted contract. He showed me how to bury clauses deep within hundreds of pages of legal jargon, how to create shell corporations, and how to build legal labyrinths that even the best forensic accountants couldn't navigate. He became my sword and my shield. The second was Morgan. Morgan ran the IT department for Loretta's hotel chain, but their real talent lay in the dark, unregulated corners of the digital world. Morgan was a cynic who preferred servers over people. We bonded over late-night coffee and a shared distrust of humanity. Morgan taught me that privacy is an illusion. They showed me how digital footprints are permanent, how every search query, every deleted email, every hidden transaction leaves a ghost in the machine if you know how to look for it. Morgan gave me the eyes to see through walls. I absorbed everything. I worked 90-hour weeks, fueled by the memory of the cold tile floor and the ticking of my father's gold watch. I stripped away the naive, soft edges of my personality. I stopped wearing bright colors. I stopped smiling to make other people comfortable. I built a titanium shell around my core. By the time I turned 21, I was no longer the shattered teenager Loretta had scraped off a park bench. I was the vice president of operations for the Montgomery Hotel Group. I had my own portfolio, my own wealth, and a mind sharpened into a deadly instrument. I was finally in a position of power, but the void in my chest left by my lost child still ached in the quiet moments of the night. It was time to fill that void, not by looking backward, but by creating a future that my biological family could never, ever touch. Thank you for listening. If you found this story interesting, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach more viewers. Thank you very much. In the state of Texas, You must be 21 years old to adopt a child as a single woman. On the morning of my 21st birthday, I did not celebrate with alcohol or a lavish party. I put on a tailored charcoal suit, drove my modest sedan down to the Family Services Agency in Austin, and sat in a sterile waiting room with a folder full of financial statements, character references, and a letter of absolute unwavering support from Loretta Montgomery. The memory of the freezing bathroom floor, the metallic smell of blood, and the agonizing emptiness in my womb had never left me. That trauma had calcified into a driving need to protect a child the way I had never been protected. I was not looking to replace the baby I lost. You cannot replace a soul. I was looking to build a new bloodline, one based entirely on choice and absolute loyalty, rather than the genetic lottery that had cursed me. The process took months of grueling background checks, interviews, and home visits, but my financial stability and Loretta's influence eventually tipped the scales. When they finally placed a 10-month-old baby boy in my arms, a child who had been surrendered to the system with no family to claim him, the heavy, titanium armor I had built around my heart cracked just a fraction. He had dark, observant eyes and a quiet demeanor. I named him Tristan. Holding him in that agency office, smelling the faint scent of baby powder and clean laundry, I made a second vow. I promised him that he would never know the sting of a cold street, but more importantly, I promised him that I would never raise him to be a victim. I did not raise Tristan with the fragile, suffocating coddling that my parents had used to control me. I raised him with the reality of the world. While other children were watching mindless cartoons, Tristan was sitting in my home office, coloring on the back of discarded profit and loss statements. I loved him fiercely, with a devotion that consumed my entire being, but my love was pragmatic. I taught him that trust is something earned over years and lost in seconds. As he grew, I noticed his mind worked differently. He didn't just play video games. He wanted to know how the code behind the games functioned. By the time he was 12, he was writing basic security scripts for Morgan, our head of IT. By 15, he was fluent in 3 programming languages. I gave him the best tutors, the best equipment, and the absolute freedom to explore his genius, but I also made sure Donovan, my corporate lawyer, sat him down and explained the mechanics of contracts, liabilities, and intellectual property. I was forging a prince for the empire I was building. I wanted Tristan to be so legally and intellectually fortified that no one, especially not the ghosts from my past, could ever manipulate him. He understood early on that we were a 2-person army. He knew the broad strokes of my past, he knew the names of the people who had thrown me away, and he shared my quiet, calculating perspective on loyalty. He was not my biological son, but he was my true heir in every way that mattered. The 15 years following Tristan's adoption were a blur of relentless, calculated expansion. Loretta Montgomery passed away quietly in her sleep when I was 28. Her passing was a profound loss, but it was not a tragedy. She had lived on her own terms, built an incredible legacy, and she left the entirety of her estate, including the controlling interest in the Montgomery Hotel Group, to me. She left me a letter in her desk that simply read, "Burn the weak men to the ground, Vivian. I'll be watching." I took her boutique hotel chain and scaled it into a massive hospitality and technology conglomerate. I aggressively bought out failing luxury properties across the country, gutted their outdated management, and installed highly efficient, tech-driven systems. We didn't just rent rooms. We owned the logistical software that powered entire supply chains in the hospitality industry. I became a ghost in the Austin social scene. You wouldn't see my face in the local gossip magazines, but my name was whispered with a mixture of deep respect and genuine fear in the corporate boardrooms. I was a 36-year-old billionaire who had seemingly materialized out of thin air. But building the empire was only half the battle. Securing it was my true masterpiece. I spent hundreds of hours locked in conference rooms with Donovan, mapping out every conceivable legal loophole. I told Donovan I wanted a financial fortress so impenetrable that a nuclear blast couldn't breach it. We established a complex web of what Donovan called bloodless trusts. These were holding companies and trust funds meticulously designed to sever any default legal rights associated with biological lineage. The law usually favors blood, Donovan explained to me one evening, adjusting his glasses over a stack of trust documents. If something happens to you, biological parents or biological siblings can sometimes crawl out of the woodwork to contest the estate, claiming emotional distress or asserting grandparents' rights to a minor. Then draft it so they can't, I replied, my voice flat. Donovan smiled, a sharp, predatory grin. He drafted clauses that explicitly named Gregory, Sylvia, and Cameron, permanently barring them from ever claiming a single cent, a single share of stock, or a single right of visitation or guardianship, regardless of the circumstances. We established irrefutable medical and legal records proving that my biological child had died 22 years ago, and that Tristan was adopted with a completely sealed, independent background. I made sure my wealth was locked behind iron doors, with Tristan holding the only key. The trap was fully constructed. All it needed was the right bait. The opportunity arrived when Tristan turned 19. He was a sophomore at a prestigious university, running a tech startup out of his dorm room that he had entirely funded himself. He had spent the last 2 years developing a revolutionary, artificial intelligence-driven software algorithm that predicted and optimized supply chain logistics for massive hotel networks. It was brilliant, it was highly scalable, and it was about to be valued at nearly $50 million. He brought the prototype to my office, and within an hour of reviewing his data, I knew this was the weapon I had been waiting for. I decided it was time to step out of the shadows. I hired a notoriously aggressive public relations firm in New York and instructed them to orchestrate a massive, viral media campaign. I didn't want a quiet launch. I wanted a spectacle. We fed the story to every major business network, tech blog, and financial magazine in the country. The headlines were perfectly crafted to trigger the deepest insecurities and the most rabid greed of my enemies. They read, "The young tech heir to the Kensington Montgomery legacy." They read, 19-year-old prodigy Tristan Kensington set to revolutionize hospitality tech. I purposefully used the Kensington name in the press releases. It was a beacon. It was a middle finger raised high in the air, broadcasting to the world that the daughter they had thrown away was not only alive, but she was holding the keys to a kingdom they could only dream of. I knew their current situations. Morgan had been keeping quiet digital tabs on them for years. Gregory's real estate firm had taken massive hits during the last 2 market downturns. He was overleveraged, bleeding cash, and desperately trying to maintain his country club lifestyle on a dwindling line of credit. Sylvia was practically a ghost in her social circles, her influence fading as their bank accounts shrank. And Cameron? Cameron was a spectacular failure. He had coasted through college on his father's money, failed at 3 different startups, and was currently drowning in offshore gambling debts. They were desperate, aging, and broke. I knew that the moment they saw those headlines, the moment they saw the words $50 million associated with a 19-year-old boy bearing their last name, their brains would short-circuit. They wouldn't see a successful young man, they would see a giant, unguarded pile of cash. They would convince themselves that because I was a young, naive 17-year-old when they last saw me, I must still be weak. They would believe that blood gives them the right to simply walk back into my life and demand a cut. I sat in my penthouse, looking out over the Austin skyline, and waited for the vultures to catch the scent. It took exactly 4 days for the first strike. I arrived at my corporate headquarters to find a sleek, silver-wrapped package sitting on my assistant's desk. It had been hand-delivered by a premium courier service. I took it into my office, put on a pair of latex gloves just to amuse myself, and sliced it open. Inside was a ridiculously expensive, vintage fountain pen, resting on a bed of velvet. Tucked next to it was a heavy cardstock note, embossed with the old Kensington family crest. The handwriting belonged to Sylvia. "Dearest Vivian," the note read. "We saw the incredible news about Tristan. We are so overwhelmingly proud of our beloved grandson. We have missed you both so terribly over the years. It is time to heal the past. Let's have dinner. All our love, Mom and Dad." I actually laughed out loud. The sheer, unadulterated delusion of it was intoxicating. Our beloved grandson. They hadn't spent a single second of their lives wondering if I was dead or alive in a ditch, but the moment a $50 million valuation hit the news, suddenly they were loving grandparents yearning for family unity. I tossed the pen into the trash can and left the note on my desk as a trophy. 2 days later, the phone calls started. Morgan had set up a dummy corporate hotline number that redirected to my private cell phone, masking my location and allowing us to record every single second of audio securely. The first time the number rang with Cameron's caller ID, I let it go to voicemail. The second time, I picked up. This was the performance of a lifetime. I didn't answer with the sharp, commanding tone of a CEO. I softened my voice. I made my breathing slightly shallow, mimicking the cadence of someone who is deeply anxious and emotionally fragile. "Hello," I whispered, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be awkward. "Vivian? Oh my God, Viv, is that you?" Cameron's voice oozed through the speaker, dripping with a manufactured, slimy warmth. "It's Cameron. I know it's been a long time." "Cameron." I let my voice crack perfectly on his name. "How did you get this number? Why are you calling me?" "I saw the articles, Viv. About you and about our boy," he said. He actually used the words, "our boy." The urge to vomit was strong, but the urge to destroy him was stronger. I was so young and stupid back then. "My parents forced me to abandon you, Viv. You have to believe me. I've lived with the guilt every single day. I just want to see my son. I want to make things right." It's too much, Cameron," I stammered, acting completely overwhelmed. "Tristan doesn't even know. I've never told him the details of what happened. I've just been so scared all these years of losing him. The trust fund, the business, it's all so complicated." "I can help you, Viv," Cameron said eagerly, taking the bait so hard I could almost hear the hook setting in his jaw. "You shouldn't have to carry this burden alone. Let me be a father to him. Let me help you manage things." "I need time," I whispered, sniffing softly into the receiver. "Please, just don't pressure me right now." I hung up the phone, immediately dropping the fragile act, and smiled as Morgan's secure server confirmed the recording was saved. They thought I was a wounded bird. They had no idea they were walking straight into the jaws of a lion. Over the next 3 weeks, I systematically fed their delusions. Morgan was having the time of their life running digital surveillance. Using legal gray area tracking software embedded in the read receipts of the emails we sent them, Morgan monitored their web traffic. The data we pulled was glorious. From the IP address registered to Gregory's failing real estate office, we logged dozens of searches for grandparents' rights in Texas, how to contest an estranged child's estate, and loopholes in corporate trust funds. From Cameron's IP address, the searches were even more pathetic: paternal rights to teenage millionaire and statute of limitations on child support. They weren't looking for family, they were looking for a payday. It was time to give them something to find. I sat down with Donovan and drafted a completely fabricated legal document. It was designed to look like a leaked, highly confidential preliminary draft of Tristan's corporate trust fund structure. The document heavily implied that Tristan was the sole heir to a $50 million technology patent, but it included a fake, glaringly stupid clause. The clause stated that because Tristan was under the age of 21, the release of the massive funds required the consensus and legal sign-off of the immediate biological family to prevent corporate fraud. It was legally nonsensical, but to desperate, greedy people who thought they were dealing with a traumatized, uneducated woman, it looked like a golden ticket. Morgan anonymously leaked this fake document to a sleazy corporate accountant who we knew played golf with Gregory. Within 48 hours, the document made its way into their hands. The reaction was instantaneous. Cameron left a voicemail that night, and all the fake warmth was gone. His true nature bled through the speaker. "Vivian, I saw the draft," Cameron snarled, his voice tight with aggression. $50 million? And you need biological family consensus to unlock it? You listen to me. I am that kid's biological father. I have rights. You are going to give me 20% of that fund, or I am going to drag you through family court so hard your head will spin. I'll tell the press you kept my son from me. Call me back and let's make a deal before things get ugly. I forwarded the voicemail to Donovan with a single word attached: extortion. Meanwhile, Sylvia and Gregory escalated their tactics. They bypassed the dummy phone number and started sending aggressive legal demands disguised as pleas for family unity to my corporate headquarters. They demanded immediate visitation with Tristan to discuss his future and protect his assets. Every move they made, every threatening email they sent, and every frantic internet search was meticulously cataloged, time-stamped, and filed away by my team. They were digging their own graves, and I was happily handing them the shovels. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Donovan walked into my office, a thick manila envelope in his hand, and a grin that stretched from ear to ear. "They did it," Donovan said, tossing the envelope onto my glass desk. "They actually did it." I underestimated their sheer, unadulterated stupidity. I pulled out the documents. It was a massive, multi-page civil lawsuit filed in the Texas family court system. The plaintiffs were Gregory, Sylvia, and Cameron. They had banded together, pooling whatever dwindling credit they had left to hire a notoriously aggressive, bottom-feeding lawyer. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of perjury. They were suing me for alienation of affection, demanding emergency grandparent visitation rights, and asserting Cameron's immediate paternal rights to Tristan. But the real meat of the lawsuit was buried in the financial demands. They petitioned the court to freeze Tristan's assets and appoint Gregory as a financial conservator over the $50 million trust, citing my supposed emotional instability and history of trauma as proof that I was unfit to manage my son's wealth. To turn up the pressure, they launched a coordinated social media smear campaign the very same day. Sylvia posted a tearful, highly edited video on Facebook, sitting in her expensive living room, crying about how her estranged daughter was maliciously keeping her beloved tech genius grandson away from his loving family out of spite. They paid for the video to be promoted in Austin business circles. The comments flooded in, people offering sympathy to the poor, heartbroken grandparents. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought the threat of public humiliation and a messy, prolonged court battle would force the fragile, broken girl they remembered to offer them a quiet, multi-million-dollar settlement just to make them go away. I sat in my leather chair, reading the lawsuit, feeling a profound, terrifying joy radiating through my chest. They had formally committed extortion. They had filed fraudulent claims in a court of law. They had put their greed on public display, completely unaware that the foundation they were standing on didn't exist. "Donovan," I said, leaning back and looking at the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Do not file a motion to dismiss. Do not send them a settlement offer. I want you to approve their request for an emergency mediation meeting." Donovan raised an eyebrow. "Mediation? You want to sit in a room with them?" "I don't want a quiet room," I replied, my voice dropping to a cold, flat register. Tristan's Tech Summit keynote is next Friday. The entire Austin business elite will be there, including the press. Invite them to the summit. Tell their lawyer that we will settle the entire matter regarding the grandson and the trust fund immediately following the presentation. Donovan's grin returned, sharper than before. Checkmate. Which brings us back to the heavy oak door of my penthouse. The pounding finally slowed, replaced by the muffled sound of Gregory angrily arguing with Cameron in the hallway. I took a deep breath, adjusted the cuffs of my pristine white blazer, and pulled the heavy brass handle. The door swung open. The three of them froze, their faces a mixture of manufactured anger and greedy anticipation. Gregory opened his mouth to shout his demands, but I didn't give him the chance to speak a single syllable. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply held out 3 VIP lanyard passes, dangling them from my fingers. "You want to discuss my son, and you want to discuss his money," I said, my voice as calm and unbothered as if I were giving them the weather forecast. "I don't do business in hallways. Tristan is giving the keynote address at the Austin Tech Summit in exactly 2 hours. You will take these passes. You will sit in the front row. And when the presentation is over, you will get exactly what you are owed. If you say one word to me right now, I shut the door and my lawyers will bleed you dry in court for the next decade. Do we understand each other?" They looked at the passes, then at my cold, dead eyes. The greed won. Gregory snatched the lanyards from my hand. I stepped back and slammed the door in their faces. 2 hours later, the grand ballroom of the Austin Convention Center was packed with over 1,000 industry leaders, investors, and local journalists. The lights dimmed. Tristan stood backstage, looking sharp in a casual black turtleneck, perfectly calm. I squeezed his shoulder, gave him a nod, and watched him walk out to thunderous applause. From my position in the wings, I had a perfect view of the front row. Gregory, Sylvia, and Cameron were sitting there, practically vibrating with arrogance. They looked around at the wealth and power in the room, clearly believing they were about to claim a massive piece of it. Tristan gave a brilliant 10-minute presentation on his logistics algorithm. He was charming, intelligent, and commanding. When he finished, the crowd erupted. But Tristan didn't leave the stage. He held up a hand to quiet the room. Before we conclude, Tristan said, his voice echoing through the massive speakers, I want to invite the CEO of the Kensington Montgomery Group, the woman who funded this vision, and the only family I have ever known, to the stage. My mother, Vivian. I walked out from the wings. The applause was deafening, but I barely heard it. My eyes were locked entirely on the front row. The smug smiles on the faces of my biological parents faltered slightly as I stepped up to the microphone. Thank you, Tristan, I said, looking out over the crowd, projecting absolute authority. We are here today to talk about the future of technology. But unfortunately, progress is often hindered by parasites from the past. Over the last week, the 3 individuals sitting in the front row, Gregory, Sylvia, and Cameron, have filed a massive, fraudulent lawsuit, attempting to seize control of my son's assets by claiming biological grandparent and paternal rights. A shocked murmur rippled through the 1,000 people in the room. The cameras flashed wildly. Gregory half stood up from his chair, his face turning a violent shade of purple. They demanded the inheritance of their grandson, I continued, my voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel. I signaled Morgan in the tech booth. The massive 50-foot LED screen behind me flashed. It didn't show code. It displayed the legal document from 22 years ago, signed by Gregory and Sylvia, explicitly disowning me. Next to it, an audio file began to play over the speakers. It was Cameron's voicemail, his sleazy voice echoing through the ballroom, demanding 20% of the fund or threatening extortion. The ballroom fell dead silent. The humiliation washing over the front row was palpable. Sylvia covered her face. Cameron looked like he was going to be sick. You demanded my child, and you demanded his money, I said, looking directly down at Gregory, letting 22 years of rage distill into a single, lethal sentence. But what child are you talking about? The baby you threw into the street died on the floor of a freezing public restroom 22 years ago. You murdered your own bloodline. Tristan is legally adopted. He has no biological relation to you. You have perjured yourselves. You have committed federal extortion. You have absolutely nothing. The silence in the ballroom shattered into absolute chaos. Journalists were shouting questions, investors were whispering frantically, and the flashbulbs were blinding. Gregory finally snapped out of his shock and lunged toward the stage, screaming obscenities, his carefully crafted country club image entirely destroyed in front of everyone who mattered in Texas. He didn't make it past the first step. Donovan had coordinated with the convention center's private security and 2 off-duty Austin police officers. They moved in instantly, grabbing Gregory by the arms. Cameron tried to run toward the side exit, but an officer blocked his path. Sylvia just sat in her chair, weeping uncontrollably, her designer handbag discarded on the floor. I stood at the podium and watched with cold, absolute satisfaction as the 3 of them were forcefully escorted out of the ballroom, their heads bowed, marching through a gauntlet of disgust and flashing cameras. They had come to the summit to claim a fortune, and they left it with their lives entirely annihilated. The fallout was swift, brutal, and completely merciless. The video of the summit went viral within an hour, trending across every major social media platform. The business community reacts violently to public scandal. By Monday morning, Gregory's real estate firm experienced a mass exodus of clients and investors who refused to be associated with a man who would extort an adopted teenager and throw his pregnant daughter onto the street. His lines of credit were frozen. Within 30 days, his company filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. He and Sylvia were forced to sell their sprawling mansion to cover their legal debts. They relocated to a cramped, two-bedroom condo in the scorching heat of Scottsdale, Arizona, entirely exiled from their social circles, living the rest of their days in disgraced isolation. Cameron's fate was significantly worse. The extortion voicemail I played at the summit was more than enough for Donovan to hand over to the district attorney. But Morgan had dug deeper. The offshore gambling debts Morgan had uncovered during our surveillance phase were tied to massive federal tax evasion. Morgan anonymously forwarded an encrypted file containing Cameron's entire hidden financial history directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. Last I heard, Cameron was facing multiple federal indictments that carry a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. I offered no settlements, no mercy, and no mediation. I let the full weight of the law and public opinion crush them into dust. A month after the summit, Tristan and I stood on the sprawling, glass-enclosed balcony of my penthouse. The Austin skyline glittered below us, a city that had once been my nightmare and was now entirely my territory. Tristan poured us both a glass of expensive red wine. We clinked our glasses together in the quiet night air. There was no grand speech. There was no lingering trauma. The ghost of the freezing 17-year-old girl who had lost everything in a public restroom was finally at peace. I had built a fortress, I had protected my son, and I had ensured that the monsters of my past would never see the light of day again. They thought they could discard me like trash, and then return 2 decades later to claim the gold I had spun from the ashes. They learned the hardest lesson of all. When you throw someone to the wolves, you better pray they don't return leading the pack. They say time heals all wounds, but I believe it just gives you the clarity to build an impenetrable fortress. When my former family lost their business, their home, and their reputation, some mutual acquaintances called me a monster. They said I should have left them a little dignity because family is still family. Tell me, do you think I went too far by completely destroying their lives and leaving them with nothing, or did they get exactly the brutal karma they deserved for throwing a pregnant teenager out into the freezing night? You are the jury now. Let me know your verdict in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening until the very end. If this story of cold, calculated justice resonated with you, and you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. It costs you nothing, but it helps me bring more incredible stories to light. See you in the next one.